December 31st, 1981. Gently the night falls, closing her arms around Kangombe's slender body as she lies in bed, shivering in anticipation. A new year is soon to be welcomed, joined by relatives making their way from afar in Kipapani. Asleep at last, and in its midst, they were suddenly struck by a blazing bolt of screams. Atacar, atacar, atacar! The men howl, and before she can recognize the voices, a deafening sound arrests the room. Suffocating cries from mothers, fathers, and children that dissolve in thin air circling her. Eyes dart towards the door, watching her mother with her newborn sister wrapped against her neck as she brokenly stutters, Corre, não olhe para trás, socorre. Her mother's stutters are all that 8-year-old Kangombe can catch in the cloud of the tumultuous moment, words that she would not carry for the next defining decade of her life. January 1st, 1982. Facing east, Kangombe starts running into the thick fingers of the night, with the mother's words as her companions in the forest of Kwanzaa Sul. Steadfast and steady, she runs as fast as her feet can carry the weight of her bad dream. She fixes her gaze on a floating light in the horizon, setting the impossible line in motion. It is 6:30 in the morning now. It could be 7, but time refuses to measure itself by exhausted feet. But she continues scaling the forest. She approaches the horizon as it swells into a crowd beneath weary green treetops. Women, men, and children, mothers, fathers, and children. She hurriedly tries to pronounce the crowd a shelter, distracted by her aching stomach. In a series of choreographed acts, the crowd splits into smaller fractions. Women gather utensils, bottles of water, and cans, pouring brown beans and tomatoes into pans resting over a bonfire. The younger ones, in their search for soft patches, branches, and leaves, start to set up camps. The weary treetops gather the smells wafting out of the fire, and the crowd gathers anew. Each of them is served a hot bean stew, to be eaten on a leaf. Eaten quietly, a man turns the silence to face Kangombe. He presents himself as one of the guerrillas belonging to the UNITA. You too are now one of us, he declares with his eyes curled into a welcoming gesture. Act 2. As they left hundreds and hundreds of miles behind, month after month, only interrupted by strategic stopovers to seek refuge in the night, UNITA's troops came to be known as the guerrillas in the bushes. These bushes and forests found themselves transformed into spaces of the everyday through which rituals of daily life would pass. Bean stew, sweet potatoes, and porridge were prepared as meals and be eaten out of leaves when food wasn't sparse, and commanders' uniforms were washed clean by young girls in streams nearby. Kangombe, herself, spent night after night pressing her back into the cold, moist soils of the forests of Bié, of Kwanzaa North, of Kwanzaa Sul, of Andulu, of Balungu. In moments of respite from the war, military education would replace the life of wandering she had grown accustomed to. Slowly, she was taught to spell her name signed to her. Scrawling one letter at a time, she wrote, Kangombe. The name given to her by her mother was now long gone, one that traced her lineage, one that was taken from her aunt and the aunt of her aunt, one replaced by a worn name belonging to the Umbundu people, a different people. Her mother tongue, too, was fading. Often at 7, in the morning when the classes began, she had already been awake for hours. Each day was marked by exercises, blending mornings into afternoons. Within running weeks, she would start reciting words from the political education classes. We shall know our roots. We shall not live through the suffering of our ancestors lived through. You who suffer in the bushes, know only this now. You are fighting for total liberation of our nation, of our people. Africa should be liberated, and the Angolan man shall be dependent only on Angolans, not the Cubans, not the Soviets. We have no knowledge of their secrets for tomorrow. They shall leave as we drove the Portuguese out of our lands. These words, propagated by the commanders-in-chief, grew into a thread that would stitch Base 35 in Balungu together, transcending generational, cultural, and tribal beliefs and systems, echoing across war zones in the Central Highlands. As weeks passed, Kangombe was assigned new chores and a new commander-in-chief. This one was a logistics man who oversaw the military logistics for Unit 35. Kangombe, instead of carrying food from base to base, would now carry arms regardless of their size, balancing their stock on their slender body. With the new tasks, she would accompany the troops on their marches over 2 or 3 days, crossing the river Kwanza, each eye loaded with the promise of liberation. Act 3. Territories immersed into war are commonly organized in various zones, some categorized as spaces of defensive, others relegated to offensive. In the bushes, these zones were occupied by UNITA's guerrilla forces. On the other side of the combat was the MPLA, mostly occupied urban landscapes across the country, from Angola's long coastal stretch to the Central Highlands. At the time of the offensives, UNITA's troops would advance across these militarized landscapes with their march towards the MPLA's regulated cities. Avanza! Avanza! Kangombe's joined a choir of girls shouting, signaling to the troops at the front, "The time has come," while passing firearms resting on her head. Sometimes she would dream of the line on the horizon, evanescent, comforting in its fading colors, but she would soon join the crowd of girls at the back, running and maneuvering from house to house to grab what was left behind: soap, salt, clothes, and food. Her feet, still unable to measure time, would eventually join soldiers in their march anew. If we paused to hesitate, the consequences could be fatal, or even worse, be caught by the enemy. Buildings robbed, cars and trees set on fire, screaming men outnumbered by gunshots, streets turned into phantoms, hours shriveled into moments. Gunshots intensify into a thunderclap, and girls run. Steadfast and steady, they run as fast as their feet can carry the weight of the bad dream. Still, more goods remain to be stolen. They have nothing to turn to except the drooping necks of ribbons fastened into their backs, curling hair. Finally, the piercing cry of "Retiro!" With stolen goods on their heads, lifeless bodies on their backs, and injured combatants in their arms, the troops set out to retreat into the bushes. Kangombe walks without a word, trying to count the number of attacks, failing. A decade impaled but with loss and longing, scouring each residue of her mother tongue, of her identity. She finds it difficult to recall the operations. She was certain, however, that there were countless, with hundreds and thousands of lives lost. September 30, 1992. As the nation approached its first multi-party election, a brief moment of ceasefire swelled the vast Angolan landscape, fueling her escape, her emancipation, as she remembered her mother's gentle, broken stutters. Corre, não olha para trás, socorre.